Good day, duelists! In today's deck profile, I'll be showcasing a deck that has started to grow very near and dear to my heart personally lately, namely Light Water Dark Hydro Hurricane Midrange. As the name implies, the deck is built around Hydro Hurricane. This spell counts the number of light and darkness creatures you have in the battle zone, and for each one it bounces your opponent's mana and battle zone respectively. So the game plan is pretty self-explanatory. Build a massive board full of light and darkness creatures and play Hydro Hurricane as a finisher to reset your opponent's game state and win the game from there. And in fact, this is not a new idea. Hydro Hurricane decks have been around since basically forever. Even 20 years ago people were building them. But the way this deck has evolved over time I find absolutely fascinating, to the point in which modern versions are almost unrecognizable from their ancient counterparts. The version that I'll be showcasing here is built for a 40 card format, so keep that in mind while we go into each individual card. Of course, if you want to go over 40, it's easy to do so, and we'll get into how to do that as we explore the deck list. So, we want to build a big board for Hydro Hurricane. How do we do that? Well, I think a good place to start is Mystria Sonic Guardian, an important centerpiece of the deck. With this on board, whenever we summon a creature, we can draw a card. And if that card is a creature, we can summon it again, and then draw a card, and again, and again, and again. And in a nutshell, that's basically the main way that we build the big board. A lot of synergies will start to become more apparent as we go through more cards, but let's move on for now. Now, the enemy of any big board is mass removal. Cards like Burst Shot, Apocalypse Vise, and especially Blizzard of Spears can really ruin your day. It doesn't matter how many creatures you manage to stick if they all get removed in one turn by one spell. With that in mind, we need cards that help us play around such mass removal spells, and the best way to do that is to increase the power of our creatures, and for that we have Paralysis Morning Guardian to start with. Paralysis buffs up our creatures by 2000 power during the opponent's turn when they can play their removal spells, rendering cards like Burst Shot completely useless all by itself. 2 copies of this bad boy are enough to even nullify the scary Blizzard of Spears. In addition, Paralysis is also a blocker, which helps fend off aggressive decks, so overall just a great card for this deck. And then we have Petrova, which can buff up a Chosen Race by plus 4000 power. You might have noticed that the 2 creatures that we've discussed so far are Guardians, and that's going to be a common theme moving forward. And also for Petrova, it cannot be targeted by your opponent's card, so it cannot die to cards like Terror Pit and such. This makes it very difficult for certain decks to deal with. In fact, the main weakness of Petrova is generally mass removal spells. Blizzard of Spears and Mecha Dragon's Breath are usually the best responses to it, but of course, combine it with 1 or 2 Paralysis and all of a sudden all of these cards become ineffective, and you can probably already see the synergies of the deck coming together. Another common deck of dealing with Petrova is summoning Bazagazil Dragon and attacking it to it, but as you'll see, this deck runs a lot of blockers, so oftentimes you can prevent that by just building your board naturally. And rounding off the light creature section, we have a couple more blockers, Laura Giga Sky Guardian and Belix the Explorer. Laura Giga is a cheap blocker, it's effective at combating Grudge decks, it becomes a 1 mana draw card with Mystrias on board, and it's also notably a Guardian, so its power is naturally bumped up when we play Petrova. As for Belix, it's needed in this deck because, well, if you draw your Hydro Hurricane early on, you don't want them clogging up your hand, you want to put them in mana, and Belix allows you to recover them later in the game. Plus, against aggressive decks, you can also just play it as a simple 2 mana blocker. If you only charge creatures in the first 2 turns, it doesn't even put you back a mana when you play it, and this deck runs a lot of creatures, so that tends to happen quite consistently. Only downside of Belix is it's regrettably not a Guardian, but you know, it is what it is. Alright, so we talked about the light creatures, and that's all well and good, but now it's time to get into the darkness section, and I think this is where the modern version of this deck differs most from Hydro Hurricane's lists of old. See, like I was saying at the start of the video, this concept of build a blocker wall and then play finisher has always existed since basically the game's inception. But it has always had one big problem. It gets absolutely bodied by control decks. After all, control decks don't give a rat's ass about your blockers. Spamming blockers on the board won't stop a burn deck from doing their Fortress Shell combos to put you at 0 mana, it won't stop Ruby Deckout from, well, decking you out, it won't stop Foul Control from snowballing the game with huge card advantage, all it does is protect your shields. And all of these decks don't care about shields, at least not until it's already way too late for them to matter. And that's been the state of Hydro Hurricane decks historically. beat aggro decks, get beaten by controls. And then one day, thanks to a duelist that goes by Cloud Alpha who's mastered this deck to perfection, Phantasmal Horror Gigazard came about. This card single-handedly prevents control decks from ever amassing any meaningful form of card advantage and puts them in a position where they have to play off their top deck, because if they hold any card in hand, it's just going to get discarded. One nice thing about Gigazard is that it plays around most common forms of removal, like Miraculous Snare can be used on it, Soul Swap can be used on it, but it puts 2 creatures in your mana zone since it's in evolution, so you're not too mad about it usually. Miraculous Rebirth can deal with it on paper, but if you have 1 Paralysis or Petrova buffing Chimeras, then that goes out the window as well. And of course there's Terror Pit, which destroys everything, but even Terror Pit is 6 mana, which means you have a chance to discard it before it comes online. All in all, Gigazard is just a fantastic card and it elevates this deck to a whole new level. But what does it evolve on? Well, thankfully, there are a couple of Chimeras that fit the deck like a glove. First there is Gigaslug, a Slayer blocker, perfect for a strategy of blocker wall building, and also a main line of defense against cards like Photoside, Bazagazil Dragon or Warlord Azonius, which are otherwise very difficult for this deck to deal with. And secondly, in terms of Chimeras, we have Gigabalza, a retrain of an old-time classic Locomotiver, but crucially, with a different race. It's a shield trigger which helps against aggro, it's a body for Hydro Hurricane wipes, it discards a card, which once again is our main form of defense against control decks. It just fits perfectly in this deck. And I can't tell you just how much better this deck feels to play with a Chimera package in it. Against control decks, you have openings like turn 3 Gigaslug, turn 4 Gigabalza, discard a card, turn 5 Gigazard, discard 2 cards, and now it's turn 5, your opponent has already discarded 3 cards and they have to play off their top decks because of Gigazard. One other nice thing about Gigazard that's important to mention is that it unlocks the game plan of poking shields without giving your opponent card advantage. So for example, I can have my Petrova break a shield, shield goes to opponent's hand, and then I can tap Gigazard to discard it. Of course, if it's a shield trigger this won't work, so do your due diligence and assess the risk properly before going in. And lastly, to round out creatures, this version of the deck runs 2 copies of Ice Vapor. This is once again an anti-control card. It makes it such that your opponent has to pay a mana and hand tax every time they cast a spell, and this is meant to target a very specific type of deck. See, there are cards that can deal with Ice Vapor efficiently, notably stuff like Magmarex, Miraculous Rebirth, even if you Volcano Charger it, it's not too bad. But the thing about all of these cards is that they are Fire Civilizations, so if you're playing against a control deck without fire, for example 4-Civ Fortress Burn, which is pretty popular, this card can single-handedly win the game by itself. That, and you also need some more attacking bodies, preferably Darkness, so you can use them for Gigazard's effect. If you're making the meta read that you will not be facing such control decks, you can replace these cards with something like Marrowooz, or even Solderlight is one that I've been experimenting with. And these are all of the creatures in the deck. Now, let's talk spells. First of all, we have 1 single copy of Corpse Charger. Graveyard Recovery turns your graveyard into a toolbox that you can access during the late game, so it's a very valuable tool. Like at some point in the game you'll probably have in there Petrova Mystria's Gigazard, and you can choose whichever one fits the situation better to add to your hand and resummon. It's great for combating Slash Charger decks as well, as oftentimes having your Petrova slashed early can feel pretty devastating. Like 1 Petrova slashed away is already half of your Petrovas, but with Grave Recovery, the slashed cards are never truly lost. So why Corpse Charger instead of something like Morbid Medicine or even Zombie Carnival? Well, you might have noticed this deck runs Birix, but it doesn't run Far-Iga because of space limitations, which means that Corpse Charger is the only card that we can recurse, so it makes sense to have this instead of the others. Plus it unlocks the Corpse plus Birix loop, you know, where you cast Corpse Charger to get your Birix back, play Birix, take your Corpse Charger back, then when Birix dies, do the whole thing all over again. It's always a fun trick to pull against aggressive decks. Next up, one of the most recent additions to this deck, 2 copies of Ghost Touch, and it's actually hard to articulate into words why Ghost Touch works so well, but it does. The point of this deck is generally to play a threat on turn 5 like Mystria's Gigazard or Ice Vapor and have it stick. Early hand disruption helps this game plan a lot. Not only can you preemptively snipe the answer they would have otherwise had for your big creatures, but you can also disrupt their early game plan in other ways which consequently makes them less likely to have said answer when the time comes. For example, sniping a Bronze Arm tribe they would have played on turn 3 can set their game plan back by 1 or even 2 turns in some cases. If you're going above 40 cards, you can max out the copies of Ghost Touch and run the full playset, or you can even run Clone Nightmare instead. It's matchup dependent which one is better, but that can probably be a whole video by itself. And for our final slots, you might have noticed that the only water card we've talked about so far is Hydro Hurricane itself, so we're in desperate need of some water mana. In that sense, we have 4 copies of Miraculous Snare, acting as our only source of hard removal. It's better than something like Turpid for this deck, not only because it is a source of water mana as previously established, but also 6 mana for hard removal is way too much for this deck. After turn 6 you really want to start being proactive, you want to start sticking body and threats, not spending an entire turn dealing with something on the board. Plus the fact that it puts the creature in shields means we can safely extract it from there with the Swing plus Gigazard discard combo that we've talked about before. And finally, for the last 4 slots of the deck, we have a playset of Energy Stream. This should be pretty self-explanatory. Stream is one of the most ubiquitous water cards out there. 3 mana to draw 2 is just solid card advantage. But for this list in particular, it's even better than usual, because it helps combat one of the most devastating cards against this deck, Cranium Clamp. Clamp is one of, if not the most disruptive cards for us, because, well, the way this deck plays out is, you prepare your turn 5 play with preemptive plays like Ghost Touch, Paralysis, or, Giga Balza, to discard your opponent's answers, and then you slam your threat and hope it sticks. But by playing these preparation cards, you are going down in hand cards yourself, and if you get clamped on 4, by turn 5 you might have like 1 or even 0 cards in hand, which makes it exponentially more difficult to stick something good. For example, remember the scenario we were talking about before where you play Giga Slug on turn 3, you play Giga Balza on turn 4, and then you play Gigazard on turn 5? That's like the ideal start against control decks, but one thing to keep in mind is that if you're going first and you play Giga Slug on turn 3, then you play Giga Balza on turn 4, now you're down to just 2 cards in hand, so if you get camped, that's it, your Gigazard gets discarded and your whole game plan goes to shit. In fact, in this scenario, if you have this opener and you know that your opponent is playing like many copies of Cranium Clamp, arguably it's better to just skip your turn 3 play, not play the Giga Slug, and just play turn 4 Giga Balza into Gigazard, just so that, after you play Giga Balza, you are now at 3 cards in hand, so when you get clamped, you can discard 2 cards and you still have your Gigazard to play on turn 5 to get your game plan going. Alright, we went on a bit of a tangent, but the point is that's why Energy Stream is so good in this deck. Playing a stream on turn 3 solves all of your clamp issues and allows you to make all your plays worry-free without fearing that you'll be forced to discard your best cards. If your opponent has Cranium Clamp ready to play on turn 4, oftentimes the game is actually just decided by whether or not you play Energy Stream on turn 3. One thing you might notice in this version of the list is that it doesn't play any defensive triggers, so no Terror Pits or such, but that is mostly okay because between all the different blockers the deck has, that's pretty much enough defense as is. Plus there are just no good defensive shield triggers to run. Things like Terror Pit or Spiral Gate simply do not synergize with the deck's game plan all that much. And that's pretty much it for the cards, a well-rounded Hydro Hurricane midrange list, good against aggro because of all of the blockers, good against controls because of all of the discard, overall just very solid, and I have enjoyed piloting this deck a lot lately. Now notably there are some matchups and cards that are very unpleasant to run into. As I mentioned before, Clamp is definitely up there, but also one unpleasant card to go up against is Petrovai itself, especially when coupled with Holio. As you might have noticed, this deck has 0 ways of dealing with Petrova. The game plan against Petrova is mostly to just ignore it, build your board faster than your opponent, and deal with everything else because alone Petrova is not that scary. But of course that doesn't always work, and sometimes you're facing a board of powered up creatures, fishing for a Hydro Hurricane, and suddenly they slam down one Holio and your entire board goes to shit. If you're expecting to run into a lot of those decks, one card I would recommend to combat them is Slime Veil. This will just force Petrova to run into your powered up blockers and can also result in card advantage by letting some attacks tactically go through so you get some shields into your hand. The reason why Slime Veil is so much better than Holio for this deck, by the way, is because your creatures are more powerful during your opponent's turn than during yours thanks to Pogo releases, so you'd much rather have your opponent attack into you rather than you attacking into them. Oof, okay, this video is getting pretty long already, so I think this is a good time as any to end it. There's still a lot more strategy to talk about, but you know, I could go on for hours about some subtle plays that you can do with this deck that can make the difference. But we talked about the game plan, about individual cards, counters and how to deal with them. But of course, if there's something I forgot to explain that you really want to know or that you have questions about, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. I strongly encourage you to try out this deck. It's been a lot of fun for me, and until next time, duelists, take care.